Hi, it's Brett, and this is episode 3 of Let's Make a Ruby Gem. In the past episodes, we introduced a class that you can require called Converty, and call the convert method to convert an amount between two different units, like kilometers and miles. All that is done in Ruby, but what I would like to be able to do is call a command line tool like Converty 10 from kilometers to miles and have that output the converted amount. This is a really good use case for a Ruby gem because people can install it and then run the commands. They have to have Ruby installed, which is a requirement. So maybe it's not the best solution in that it's not a compiled binary executable, but it's pretty decent for those working in the Ruby environment and who already have it installed. This is a lot like the Rails command, which supports so many different options, and rake and bundle, all bundlers, bundle command. There's so many different ones, and you can create some really useful tools that way. So let's go and test drive that out for Converty. The first place we'll start is by adding a spec for it. We'll call it CLI spec. And we'll RSpec describe instead of a constant, because we're not describing a constant, we're describing this kind of command line tool. I'm just going to say describing the Converty command line interface, and we'll say it supports the help docs, the help flag. RSpec has this nice syntax we can use to make assertions on what is being output to stdout, because we don't want to test the Ruby code. We want to test the command line interface run through bash. So in Ruby, you can call system, and we'll call out to exe/converty, which is the file that will contain our script. It's the entryway for our command line. You can call it the system, which will run it, and we can pass that into a block and say expect it to output. Let's say it'll output some help text about like convert an amount between unit types to stdout. I wrote this part down to stdout from any process. Whoops. Got that in there twice. So I can't remember that. And we'll just copy and paste it from there. So we've got a test. Let's run it and see what happens. It fails. It says expected block to output convert amount, but it output nothing because it's not built and functioning yet. So, I'm having some keyboard difficulties. Oh, there we go. Got it fixed. That error is not super useful, so I would like to also add a, I forgot the help flag, but I'd like to add a first assertion that says to output to not output to standard error from any process, because that will actually output our error first, which is really nice. So anyway, that failed. And we've got that so far. So first thing to show here is in our gemspec file, there is a spec.bindir, which is the folder where the executables live for these command line tools, which is different than bin, which is kind of confusing because it says bindir. But these bin console and bin setup scripts are for development, where these executables, these command line tools, are going to be intended for outside use. So when bundler set up our new gem, it said lives in exe, and then it sets all the executables to the files in that directory. So we need to make dir exe, and then we want to, within our exe directory, add our converty file. And we'll save that. We need to chmod it, change its permissions to be an executable file. So we'll do a plus x, which makes it executable. And we'll reload it. And then we just need to do a couple of the little setup that will copy and paste actually from other places. So we've got this, it says it's bash, but we're actually going to change it to Ruby. I think the console command is actually pretty nice too. So it says use it to Ruby, and we are going to go ahead and require these. So if we take that, let me make sure I did that right. Yep. We'll reopen it so that we get our Ruby syntax highlighting. We actually don't necessarily need these yet, so let's remove them. This is just for Rubocop to be happy, and I'm not too worried about that yet. So let's get rid of that too. Now if we run this again, it'll still fail because it's not doing anything. But let's make it actually do something. We'll put high, and we'll run our test again. And you'll see that instead of convert an amount between unit types, it actually output high because we just puts high. That is nice. We have an actual failing test that's doing something. We can also, from the command line, run our new script, which just puts out high, evaluated through Ruby, which that's not too terribly useful, but we're getting there. And then we're going to use this library in this Ruby standard library called option parser that helps us with command line option arguments. It's included in Ruby, so all you have to do is require op parse. You don't have to install another gem or anything. And it gives us some nice functions to support arguments. And it also automatically supports the help flag, which is really, really cool. So we have to require op parse, and then we call option parser dot new, and then you pass it a block with the options. I have to reference it because I don't know this by heart yet, but we definitely passed in the banner, which is going to be our help text. It automatically works that way. And we need to call parse. That should be enough to get this working. Expected block to output convert amount between unit types of standard out, but output convert an amount between unit types with a new line. So we're going to say a string including, which is an RSpec matcher that says it's a partial matcher where it has this whole string, but at least part of it will contain this string. And it's pretty nifty. So we have a passing test, and we have the very first hints of parsing the command line options. There are other tools, other libraries you can use, like Thor, that are more powerful. Powerful might not even be the right option, but are more structured and have different ways of working. But this is nice in that it's included in Ruby and well documented and pretty flexible. So that's something cool that we can do to start there. Now let's actually get to the converting part. So we'll say it supports converting miles to, we'll say kilometers to miles. We continue to do that. We'll say that here's actually something we could do too that's nice. This command string is being used in multiple places. So let's dry that up just to make it easier to maintain. Let's make sure that's still passing. Okay, that still passes. So we'll say command, and we'll say now our command is going to be exe converty. And now we're gonna design the API where we'll say 5 from kilometers to miles don't output any errors, and we're gonna say output a string including, but we're not gonna do a string including, we're gonna do just output 3.1, and we'll see what happens. When we run it, our to.output to standard error from any process, we expected nothing to be output, but instead what was output was invalid option from, because we haven't specified the from option in our option parser. So what we do is we say options, and it's on is the function we can pass. You can pass the short version, then you can pass the long version, and you have to specify what it is in all caps. That's used in the documentation too, and it lets it know it's not just a true or a false flag. And these are the things you just learn from documentation. And then the third param is the documentation. So it's the unit to convert from. Actually, the unit of the first argument, of the unnamed first amount argument. Run that again. We get a different failure, invalid option 2. So we'll do the same thing for 2. The unit to convert the amount to must be of the same measurement type as the from arg. Let's run that again. And it expected to output 3.1, but it output nothing because we aren't actually outputting anything yet. So a goofy thing done before is you can just put 3.1 and it passes. It has a new line at the end because outputs a new line. So that passes, which isn't very satisfying. So let's write another test that does a similar thing. So we'll say from 2 feet to inches. And we'll expect that to output 24 with the new line. Now if we run it, it's still outputting 3.1 because that's hard-coded. Let's actually implement the code to make this work. We're going to call converty.convert. We get the amount through argv, which comes from Ruby. It's the arguments passed in the command line. It's an array. And we're just going to take the first amount, the first item in that array, which will be our amount. And then we'll call from, which will have our from. We'll have our to, which will have our to. We don't have those quite yet. So what we need to say is that we parse these values into our args hash, which we don't have quite yet. So we'll make an empty hash called args. We'll parse it into it. And then what that'll end up being is it'll make like args at this point looks like something like from, 10 to, or sorry, it looks like from kilometers to miles. And we can then access it by saying args from args to, and then we'll puts it so that it gets output. We've got an error called undefined method for converty module no method error. And that is because in our command line code, we actually don't have the converty code required yet. All we need to do there is we can copy this from the console, run it again, and we now have access to the converty code because we've required it. I think this bundler setup is needed for it to work. I'm almost certain. Well, no, it didn't. So that's interesting. Let's be double sure we don't have converty installed. Great. So I guess we don't need that bundler setup. But anyway, might not be a bad idea because the other one has it. Something more to learn about. Let's go and run our test again. All right, we run it and it fails. It says feet is an invalid unit, inch is an invalid unit. And the reason for that failure is that we have a problem where when, let's get the command line open. When it parses these options, they're just strings, but our Converty code here for from and to expects them to be symbols. Like our documentation shows, wants them to be symbols. What we can do now is actually make it so that from and to are supported, support string arguments and converts them to symbols. So what we can do then is improve the resilience of our code and say it supports coercing from and to params to symbols. We'll take an existing spec, copy it over, but instead of passing in miles as a symbol and kilometers as a symbol, we'll pass them as strings. And we get that same error that we had from our command line. We can say from is equal to from to sim, which converts it to a symbol. We'll do the same for to. And now that passes. We'll run the rest of our unit tests for the Converty class, and that passes. And now we can go back to our test here and see if that passes. We get an error, which is something different now, which is string can't coerce. That's a different error, which is related to passing in the argv here is going to be a string. And we're trying to convert a string and do math on a string. That's where that asterisk comes from. It's trying to multiply a string, which is impossible. We could convert argv here to a float, but why not just make our convert method more resilient? So we can say something like it supports coercing amount from a string. We'll pass in 3.1 as a string. We see string can't be coerced in the float when it's trying to multiply. All we got to do there is say amount is equal to amount 2f. We're working a lot with floats in here, so we'll try to convert it to a float and keep on with that process. Okay, so that's passing. Our unit tests are, let's go back or run the command line. Look at that. That's passing. Pretty nice. Let's run this other one and see what happens. Now we have this repeating decimal for the 5 kilometers to miles. It would be nice, well, in the Ruby code, we're calling round here, which is nice because we have access to round in Ruby. It's really simple, but we don't, not as simple from the command line. So what if we actually had a command flag where we could round it to a certain number of decimal places? So let's round it to 2 decimal places. And let's actually expect it to be 3.11 instead of 3.1. So we changed our test, we'll run it again. We get an error here, which is expected no error, but it was output invalid option round. Let's go and change that. We'll call on R, and we'll call it round, and we'll call it decimal places. We'll say optional argument for how many decimal places to round to. Great, let's run it again. Change it. Fails because we didn't actually do the rounding, but it supports the flag. Now what we would want to do is actually make use of it if it's present. So we'll say, here's the amount, and in our args, we'll have the round key. We'll say if round is equal to round, amount is equal to amount dot round, pass in the decimals to round to, and then we put some out. Run that again. no implicit conversion of string into int. All right, that is because args here is a string, so we just want to call toI. We'll expect it to be a whole number. I think that's fair. We'll run it, and it passes. So now we have passing for passing specs for the other ones, but we have a new failure, which is expected 24.0, but it output 24 as a whole number, which I find really interesting. So why did it round it? I think what we want to do is say, here it's toI, which means that it's going to convert. I'll show you through the console actually. If you call nil toI, it's 0, so it's going to round to the 0th place, which actually isn't what we want. So we've just introduced a bug, and it's not what we want. We want to say if it's not nil, this round gets assigned, and then we convert it to an integer here. All right, now those are passing again. So we found a good bug there and just fixed it. That gives us a pretty decent command line interface. We can run it with using .. We've got some issues here. It's saying undefined method toSim for no class because we didn't pass anything. But let's do from inches to feet. We get 0.833 repeating, and let's round it to 4 decimal places. So there we go. It's a command line interface that's calling out to our Ruby code. It's making use of the flags and the arguments. We can call help. Tells us convert an amount between unit types, which comes from the banner that we set for the option parser. Tells us our different flags that you can pass in to help people be able to use it. And we can also even provide an example here. These new line characters will just help, but we'll provide a usage. We'll say something like Converty 5 kilometers. We'll say from kilometers to miles round 1. And that will now come out when we say help to give people an example of how to use it, which is, I think, pretty nifty. It's probably a mess of text on the right side, but that's kind of what the command line turns into at times. That covers the simple introduction of some flags, and I would like to now drive out some errors just to better expand and improve this command line interface we've created. Let's say it requires an amount to be specified. Now before, where we were saying to not output the standard error from any process, we're actually going to say expect it to output, and we'll say a string including amount must be specified. And we'll change this flag to, we'll change the command to just be that. Get some errors here. Looks like it might have to do with some of the code we wrote, or that I wrote. I'm missing a paren here. Run it, and we get nothing to standard out, which is because we haven't coded it yet. Let's just simplify this too. All right, now we get an error which says undefined method toSim for nil class. What we want to say here is amount is, or argv is equal to 0. Let's say we'll call that, we'll call it original amount. And we'll say if original amount is nil, raise amount parameter required. That will make the program fail with a non-zero exit status, saying that there was an error, and we'll go from there. So the message is a little different. Let's just change that. right, let's see why that failed. I'm probably missing a parenthesis. Yep, so now that's passing. And if we try to run it with no 10, it says it's required. And if we miss some flags, we get similar errors, but I think for now that covers it. We would do something very similar where we would say like, well, let's just do it. It'll be pretty quick. Say it requires the from and to args be specified. And we'll just say 10. We'll say output a string including from parameter required to parameter required. All right, let's see that. We're getting our toSim error instead of the error we want. We'll now check this. And we'll say if args from is nil. We'll say if args 2 is nil. We'll have an errors array, which will help us out. Errors.push that. Say from parameter required to parameter required. And let's actually make this make this more clear too. Converty amount from unit to unit. That'll just kind of give some better help docs here. But okay, we have our error checking, and then we'll say if errors.any raise errors.join, we'll join them by a comma and a space. So this proactively requires that we have our different required arguments set. And otherwise it throws an error. I think that covers quite a bit of it. We've got rounding, we've got required parameters. We also have our errors still from the rest of it. So if we like pass in a fake one like fx, it says fx is an invalid unit, and we can cover that by a test just to make sure it works from the command line. It requires valid units. So that passes, and nice to have that there. That is how you add a command line. We've got to do some parsing of the arguments and some checking for errors, but eventually it gets us to this point where we call out to the code that we've written elsewhere that is part of our library too, and then we can output it, we can round it, we can go from there. Maybe convert supports a round argument in the future where you can round it from there, but for now I think this works and covers that behavior and is a nice setup. The next step is to just show you how to install and use this. We take it and we can do gem build converty.gemspec. That will create this file based upon our version and allow us to install it, just like we've seen in past episodes. So if we ls gem, we see converty 0.1.0. 0.2.0 is from a first attempt at this video where the audio is messed up. So I have committed already and built that gem and pushed it up to rubygems.org. But for here, we've got converty 0.1.0 with the gem that we just built, and we'll install that really quick. And I'll show you how you can use it. Let's delete this other one, and let's gem install Converty 0.1.0 gem. And that allows us to, I'll show you, do gem list, and we'll grep for Converty. It has 0.1.0 installed. We can then call Converty from the command line. At least I would hope so. Interesting. Why didn't that work? I'm a little bit surprised. Let's look at our gem spec. Also, we can run RSpec, make sure everything's passing there. We've got our exe. Let's see what's in exe. We have Converty. Let's see what's going on there. Oh, I think we have to, I think this files requires it to be checked into Git, so let's just do that. We'll say add Converty command line interface. And then we can take that and let's do gem build again. Okay, now we'll do gem install Converty with that file. That should reinstall it. We'll verify it's installed. Let's actually change the version for this example, and just to show that it's a different one. So let's gem build it, made 0.2.0, let's install it. Let's list it and grep it. We've got both of them installed, so let's actually uninstall Converty version 0.1.0. And now let's do that again. We've just got 0.2.0. Now if we run Converty, we get an error. It says amount parameter required from parameter required to parameter required. Let's do Converty help. Convert an amount between unit types usage. Converty amount from to, and then it shows an example. So now we can go ahead and find out how many miles are in a 50-kilometer race. 3.1 repeating. Let's say we'll round it to 2 places. And we've got our command line interface. Kind of neat. Preparing for this episode, I learned quite a bit and was really happy to have picked all that up and learned how to test the output of a command line call with system, and learned about the option parsing and validating those params. We've also made our Converty convert method more resilient to support passing in strings. There will be issues if you pass in something that can't be converted, like something like if you passed in a string like that. So it works, but it doesn't throw an error, which I think it probably should. So there's still some edge cases here, but we've got this working, and I hope that helps you see how you can build out something like this and go from here. I would suggest checking out Thor and other libraries and reading the docs on Option Parser, because there's lots of really neat stuff you can do there. But this gets us started and makes a nice little tool for us to use. Thanks for watching, and looking forward to making the next episode.